In the actions list input, users can insert actions one by one. If users do not require guidance and already have data in the correct data template, they can move right on to actions list overview. But if users do this assessment for the first time or are not very knowledgeable about sub and non-state actions, it is recommended that they use this sheet to insert the actions. I will just start inserting one, for example, steel factory, which aims to reduce emissions. In this action description, users can give as much information they want about their action, but they can also leave it empty. It's not a required entry. Required entries are shown with this little star, the asterisk, and as you can see, it's missing here. Again, there are info boxes provided that gives more information about each entry. In this case, the steel factory is a company as an actor type. The target type is a GHG, greenhouse gas emission reduction target. And we want to include it in our analysis. If users click on bookkeeping only, the required entries do not have to be all filled, and it might be that if they are not filled, that the action is not inserted into the aggregation or landscape analysis. In this case, I would say that this is an individual action. The steel factory has set their target self and is not part of an international initiative. The sector targeted would be industry, and then it's an optional entry to insert the subsector. And there's also, in some cases, a third sector that could be chosen, in this case, the iron and steel production. In jurisdiction overlap, which is not a required entry, the users can determine whether the action encompasses actions of smaller actor types. That means, for example, a region that can encompass a city. So if a city lies within a region, it encompasses the city. This is important for the overlap calculations, and I will get back to that later. In this case, it is a company, a small company, so we say it's not encompassing any other actions or actors. Geographic coverage is also not a required entry, but we can say that it's a regional because it's a pretty large factory, for example. It's interesting to see in the landscape analysis later. And the steel factory has, for example, committed to a non-binding commitment. Then, because we have selected GHG emissions target here, we can only insert GHG emission target information here. If you have not made a choice yet, it would also give the electricity related target and in kind of a same format as this table here. And if you only click on electricity related target, it would only give the electricity target information. For example, the base year is 2005 for this action. And in that year, the scope 1 emissions were 10,000 tons. And the scope 2 emissions were 6,000 tons. Then the latest inventory year is not a required entry. If there is no information, users can leave it empty, but if they have, they can insert it. For example, in 2010, the scope 1 emissions were 9,000, but the scope 2 emissions increased slightly to 6,500. Then for the target year 1, for example, it would be 2030. And the steel factory would aim for a 10% decrease in scope 1 emissions and a 50% decrease in scope 2 emissions. Then for the second target year, which is not a required entry, so if the actor only has one target, they can leave this empty. But if they have a second target, for example, a long-term target, they can insert it here. So for example, 2050, then the steel factory aims for 50% reduction, and also it stays at 50% reduction of the scope 2. Let's make it 60 to make more impact. Then a reference or a source could be, for example, from own knowledge, because we don't have a source, and we leave this empty. It is important to determine that the reduction targets or the percentage below base year is really targeting the base year emissions. So in this case, it would be 10% below the 10,000, and in this case, the 50% below the 10,000. It's good to keep that in mind. For the qualitative impact assessment, we can insert what the potential impact is, for example, major, but it's unlikely that it's actually implemented. Then we click on data check if it's all done. There's a training note here that says, does the actor have more than one target? Then please make sure to split the emissions accordingly to avoid overlap. That means that the steel factory could also have an electricity related target next to this one. In this case, we would recommend to not include scope 2 emissions here because these are related to electricity, and let the electricity related emissions fully depend on the electricity related target, or don't insert the electricity related target into your analysis. Please keep in mind that this is an aggregation tool, not a quantification tool. So please convert the targets to appropriate units. Users can then use the worksheet to do this, where they can perform free calculations, as I said before. So please always convert them to ton CO2 equivalents or the electricity related target information. So now we get the warning or notification that all data has been input correctly. Please proceed. And with that in mind, we can insert the data. And we get the notification that everything has been entered, which is all the way down here, the steel factory, with all our information that we've inserted into the action list. And I will get back to this later, but first I would like to insert another action, and for that I click on reset. And I will insert another action. For example, for an actor that's called Drinks for All, and Drinks for All want to reduce their electricity emissions and increase their efficiency. This is also a company. It's an electricity related target. So the sheet updates to get that information. We want to include it in our analysis. It is part of an international initiative. For example, the Renewable Electricity 100 initiative could be part of it. The sector targeted would again be industry. Then under other production, food and drink. Again, because it's a company, it does not encompass actions of smaller actor types. So no. Geographical coverage is only a small factory, so we would insert city. The action status, it's under consideration. It has not been approved by the board, for example. Then, as you can see here, the action target information is automatically updated to only present electricity related target information. Base year could be, for example, 2010. The electricity demand in that base year would, for example, be 7,000 megawatt hours, of which only 5% was renewable. Drinks for All does not have a latest inventory year, so we can leave that empty. And then we can determine in the electricity demand assumptions if we want to input annual growth rate to determine future electricity demand or input it ourselves. If we click on this, a pop-up screen gives us the option to insert a percentage by which the annual electricity consumption is increased. So for example, we insert 2.5%, and then I clicked already on calculate, but I did not insert a target year yet, so it gives me a warning. So this would be 2014, and now it calculates the electricity demand. We can also then determine what our future share of renewable energy of this would be. So they have a target to increase their renewable electricity consumption. So it would be, for example, 50% of this would be from RE. And Drinks for All does not have a second target year, for example. Also, this would be from own knowledge. and we don't have a link for it. We can leave these empty. We don't have any information about it, and they are not required entries. So we can do data check. All data has been input correctly. Please proceed. That's great. And now we can insert the action into our actions list overview. And it gives me the notification that all data has been entered successfully in the actions list overview. And there it is, drinks for all. And as you can see, it automatically grays the fields here, which would be greenhouse gas emission targets. And it leaves open these fields, which are literacy related targets. And for the steel factory, where we inserted the GHG emissions related target, it's the exact opposite, the way around. In the actions list overview, all actions are summarized and an overview is provided, including the ones that we've just inserted through the actions list input. There are a few things to keep in mind while using this sheet. Please always read the blue and yellow box first. The yellow cells are required data entries or can be adjusted by the user. And the gray cells have calculations or cannot be adjusted by the user. For example, this is a calculation. In this sheet, the information for specific columns is provided in the headers. So if you click on the headers, this little pop-up box is given. If users want to update the gray formula cells, for example, these ones, they should click on this gray bar here. And if you're all the way down here, you can click on the yellow bar to go back to the top. Users can use the drop down here to determine if they want to include the action in the aggregation or not. So if I click on no, and I click to update gray formula cells, and I would go all the way back to the right, it gives me no as a summary to include in the aggregation or not. Here, it is checked whether the actions are within the assessment boundary. So it checks for actor type, target type, action type, and sector. In this case, it meets all criteria of the assessment boundary, so the action is included in the aggregation. In this case, it also meets all the assessment boundary criteria, but we've selected no to not include it in the aggregation, so it still does not feed into the aggregation. We can do a data check to find out if we've inserted all data correctly. And in this case, we get a warning signal. And then if we click OK, it leads us to the cell where something is wrong. And in this case, it's the first action that was inserted because it does not have a target year. So we already know that this is not going to be included in the aggregation because of this. And therefore, it is a no here. And it's not even given whether it meets the assessment boundary or not. It's just not sufficient information. So it already pulls a full stop there. If users click on reset, the whole sheet is cleared and users can start with a fresh new actions list.